opening the next session. It is a very innovative workshop, and we are very, very grateful to the organizers to include the issue of nuclear weapons. Our presentation is Survival and Soil, Why Nuclear Weapons Still Matter. I must say that both movements on climate change and nuclear disarmament are, at the end, one for survival. And I have the honor to introduce Jacqueline Cabasso, a long-term activist, a winner of the Sean McBride Prize for Peace at the UN. And she's going to start the conference right now.
Thank you, Marcia. And I will be followed by Marcia Campos, who is the project director of the North of Tlatelolco project at Western States Legal Foundation, and my colleague Andrew Lichterman, senior research analyst for Western States Legal Foundation. Western States Legal Foundation was founded in 1982 to provide legal support for nonviolent anti-nuclear protesters, initially at the Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant on the southern coast of California, and then at the Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Weapons Laboratory. And our work has evolved in a lot of interesting directions since that time. So without further ado, I will begin. A few years ago, while taking part in solidarity demonstrations here in San Francisco in support of the Standing Rock Sioux Nation's opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline, I was struck by two recurring demands: keep it in the ground and honor treaty obligations. The first refers, of course, to oil. The second maintains that the pipeline's construction constitutes a direct violation of the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which delineates land rights between the U.S. government and the different bands of the Great Sioux Nation. Every time I heard these demands, I thought they could be talking about nuclear weapons. Why aren't they? We also need to keep uranium in the ground. Uranium is the essential element needed to produce nuclear weapons and nuclear power. Native communities, primarily in the western U.S., have been chronically exposed to low doses of radiation since the beginning of the nuclear age as a result of uranium mining and milling, uranium conversion and enrichment, and testing of nuclear weapons. More than 1/2 of all U.S. uranium deposits lie under reservation land. Honor the Treaty of Ruby Valley. This treaty of peace and friendship, signed by the United States and the Western Shoshone Nation, or New Segovia, in 1863, recognized Shoshone territorial sovereignty, but allowed the U.S. free passage through the territory. Yet in 1951, the Western Shoshone Territory was seized by executive order of President Harry Truman to create the Nevada test site, which has become known as the most bombed nation on Earth. The 928 American and 19 British nuclear explosions conducted in New Segovia between 1951 and 1992 have been classified by the Western Shoshone National Council as bombs rather than tests, because the purpose of a bomb is to destroy, while the idea of a test is to introduce something new. About 1,350 square miles of their total territory of about 43,000 square miles has been destroyed by hundreds of craters and tunnels, which are de facto uncontrolled underground nuclear waste dumps. Since 1943, there have been 2,056 nuclear weapons test explosions by at least 8 countries. Most of these tests have been conducted on the lands of indigenous and colonized people. The United States conducted 1,030 of those test explosions in the atmosphere, underwater, and underground, while the USSR carried out 715 nuclear test detonations. Not only did these nuclear test explosions fuel the development and spread of new and more deadly types of nuclear weapons, but hundreds of thousands of people have died and millions more have suffered and continue to suffer from illnesses directly related to the radioactive fallout from nuclear detonations in the United States, islands in the Pacific, in Australia, China, Algeria, across Russia, in Kazakhstan, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and elsewhere. In Kazakhstan, where the Soviet Union conducted its first nuclear weapons test explosion 70 years ago, there were more than 450 nuclear test detonations, including 116 in the atmosphere. Large areas of the Semipalatinsk test site still remain contaminated 30 years after a grassroots movement forced the end of nuclear testing at the site in 1989. Now, in their fourth generation, people living in that vicinity still suffer from poor health, such as cancers, major birth defects, and blood diseases. Many other areas will also remain unusable until and unless the radioactive contamination can be remediated. The government of Kazakhstan estimates that some 1.5 million people were harmed by the Soviet-era nuclear tests. In the Marshall Islands, where the United States detonated massive above-ground nuclear test explosions in the 1940s and 1950s, several atolls are still heavily contaminated. Indigenous populations have been displaced and are suffering lasting radiation-related illnesses and birth defects, and some buried radioactive waste could soon leak into the ocean. A 1990 National Cancer Institute study concluded that fallout from nuclear blasts at the Nevada test site may have caused 10,000 to 75,000 thyroid cancers. There were few, if any, Americans in the contiguous 48 states at the time who were not exposed to some level of fallout. During the 1980s, fear of nuclear war was by far the most visible issue of concern for people around the world. On June 21st, 1982, at the conclusion of the UN Second Special Session on Disarmament, 1 million people rallied in New York City's Central Park, calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons, and huge solidarity demonstrations took place around the world. That day, I was among some 1,500 people arrested nonviolently blocking the gates to the Livermore Nuclear Weapons Laboratory, about 40 miles from here. The Livermore Lab is one of 2 U.S. labs that have designed and developed all U.S. nuclear weapons and continue to do so. The other is Los Alamos Lab in New Mexico, the site of the original Manhattan Project. Yet following the end of the Cold War, nuclear weapons fell off the public's radar screen. It was almost as if the planet itself breathed a huge sigh of relief. People around the world hoped and believed that they had escaped a nuclear holocaust and largely put nuclear weapons out of their minds. Most people believed that the threat of nuclear war had ended, but it hadn't. Deeply embedded in the U.S. military-industrial complex, military planners and scientists at the nuclear weapons labs conjured up new justifications to sustain the nuclear weapons enterprise. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Colin Powell, then chair of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, declared, quote, "We no longer have the luxury of having a specific threat to plan for. What we plan for is that we're a superpower. We are the major player on the world stage with responsibilities and interests around the world." On August 6, 1945, the United States unleashed the atomic age, dropping a single atomic bomb on Hiroshima, indiscriminately incinerating tens of thousands of children, women, and men in an instant. It was a tiny and crude nuclear weapon by today's standards, justified by a lie of historic proportions that the bombing ended World War II and saved American lives. Over 90% of the doctors and nurses in Hiroshima were killed or injured by the bomb. 3 days later, the United States dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. By the end of 1945, more than 210,000 people, mainly civilians, were dead, and the surviving A-bomb survivors, who are known as hibakusha, their children and grandchildren, continue to suffer from physical and psychological effects of the bombings. So to illustrate the unimaginable violence of nuclear weapons, I want to read you some quotes from Takashi Hiraoka, the mayor of Hiroshima, before the International Court of Justice in 1995. Quote, "The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki shattered all war precedent. The mind-numbing damage these nuclear weapons wrought shook the foundations of human existence. Beneath the atomic bomb's monstrous mushroom cloud, human skin was burned raw. Crying for water, human beings died in desperate agony. With thoughts of these victims as a starting point, it is incumbent upon us to think about the nuclear age and the relationship between human beings and nuclear weapons. The unique characteristic of the atomic bombing was that the enormous destruction was instantaneous and universal. Old, young, male, female, soldier, civilian. The killing was utterly indiscriminate. The entire city was exposed to the compound and devastating effects of thermal rays, shockwave blast, and radiation. Above all, we must focus on the fact that the human misery caused by the atomic bomb is different from that caused by conventional weapons. Human bodies were burned by the thermal rays and high-temperature fires, broken and lacerated by the blast, and insidiously attacked by radiation. These forms of damage compounded and amplified each other. The bomb reduced Hiroshima to an inhuman state utterly beyond human ability to express or imagine. It is clear that the use of nuclear weapons, which cause indiscriminate mass murder that leaves survivors to suffer for decades, is a violation of international law, end quote. As described by Eric Schlosser, whose 2014 book, Command and Control, Nuclear Weapons, the Damascus Accident, and the Illusion of Safety, documents a remarkable number of serious fires, explosions, false attack alerts, and accidentally dropped bombs that have occurred in the US. He wrote, quote, "The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was an incredibly crude and inefficient weapon. When it exploded, about 99% of the uranium that was supposed to undergo this chain reaction didn't. It just blew apart in the air. Maybe 2% of the fissile material actually detonated. This major city, Hiroshima, was destroyed in an instant, and 80,000 people were killed, and 2/3 of the buildings in this enormous metropolitan area were destroyed instantly because 0.7 of a gram of uranium-235 became pure energy." To imagine how small of an amount that is, 0.7 of a gram of uranium is about the size of a peppercorn. 0.7 of a gram weighs less than a dollar bill. Even though this weapon was unbelievably inefficient and almost 99% of the uranium had nothing to do with the destruction of Hiroshima, it was a catastrophic explosion. Nuclear weapons since have become remarkably efficient and small and capable of destruction that makes Hiroshima seem trivial, end quote. Today, nearly 14,000 nuclear weapons, most an order of magnitude more powerful than the US atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, more than 90% held by the United States and Russia, with over 6,000 each, continue to pose an intolerable threat to humanity, and the dangers of wars among nuclear-armed states are growing. The other nuclear-armed states are France, China, United Kingdom, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea, with arsenals ranging from 25 to 300 weapons each. Iran does not have nuclear weapons. Let's look at the damage that just one modern nuclear weapon could inflict. In a 1999 study for the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, our colleague, physicist M.V. Ramana, wrote, quote, "Based on the available population data, the historical experiences of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and different physical models, we have estimated short-term casualties from a hypothetical explosion over Bombay. For a 15-kiloton explosion, the size of the Hiroshima bomb, the number of deaths would range between 160,000 to 866,000. A modern 150-kiloton weapon could cause somewhere between 736,000 and 8,660,000 deaths. In addition, there would be several hundreds of thousands of people who would suffer from injuries or burns. Many of them may die without prompt medical aid, which is quite unlikely. These estimates are conservative, and there are a number of reasons to expect that the actual numbers would be much higher. Further, these estimates do not include the long-term effects like cancers that would afflict thousands of people in the following years, or genetic mutations that would affect future generations. General George Lee Butler, retired commander of U.S. Strategic Command, who had been in charge of U.S. nuclear war planning, in 1999 stated, quote, "It is imperative to recognize that all numbers of nuclear weapons above zero are completely arbitrary. That against an urban target, one weapon represents an unacceptable horror. That 20 weapons would suffice to destroy the 12 largest Russian cities with a total population of 25 million people, 1/6 of the entire Russian population. And the US has over 6,000. Further, and directly related to the subject of today's conference, according to an updated study by the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, a quote-unquote limited regional nuclear war in which 100 nuclear weapons were used, also could severely disrupt the global climate for as much as a decade, causing crop failures and famines affecting up to 2 million people. Returning to the theme of honored treaty obligations, against the ongoing failure of U.S. and other nuclear-armed states to meet their nuclear disarmament obligations enshrined in the 1970 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and established by customary international law, we are living in a time of unprecedented growing nuclear dangers. President Trump's recent withdrawal of the United States from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is one of many signs of deepening crises among the nuclear-armed states. Following the 2002 U.S. withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, it imperils the entire structure of arms control and disarmament, including prospects for extension of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which expires in 2021, and may well lead to new unpredictable rounds of arms racing. We're already seeing signs of that. Last year, the U.S. declared that it will no longer implement the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, and will reimpose sanctions on Iran that are inconsistent with the deal. This is a major blow to international governance and to peace and disarmament in the region and the world. Also last year, Trump reaffirmed his shocking 2017 decision to withdraw the U.S. from the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet leader who signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with U.S. President Ronald Reagan in 1967, has warned, quote, "The United States has in effect taken the initiative in destroying the entire system of international treaties and accords that served as the underlying foundation for peace and security following World War II." Donald Trump entered office with the U.S. poised to spend an estimated $1.2 trillion over the next 30 years to maintain and modernize its nuclear bombs, warheads, and delivery systems, and the infrastructure to sustain the nuclear enterprise indefinitely. This enormous estimate has already gone up to $1.7 trillion and is growing. I also want to mention that in 2017, the U.S. spent about 35% of the world's total military spending, more than 2.5 times as much as China and Russia combined. The U.S. military budget for 2019 is $716 billion. Trump's 2018 nuclear posture review set forth plans to maintain, upgrade, and diversify the U.S. nuclear arsenal and the infrastructure to support it. It carries forward existing plans for the replacement and upgrading of submarine-based, land-based, and air-based nuclear forces, while adding a new sea-based cruise missile. It also calls for near-term deployment of some low-yield warheads on submarine-based missiles. And it describes how nuclear weapons might be used in response to attacks of a non-nuclear nature, including cyber attacks against critical U.S. infrastructure. In its entirety, this program, which envisions U.S. reliance on extensive and diversified nuclear forces for decades to come, is an anti-disarmament program. Mirroring the U.S. stance, Russian President Vladimir Putin, in a March 2018 speech, boasted about new invincible Russian nuclear weapons and gave detailed description, complete with video animations of an array of new nuclear weapons delivery systems, including a nuclear-powered cruise missile and an underwater drone. All of the nuclear-armed states are engaged in nuclear weapons modernization programs. Derek Johnson, Executive Director of Global Zero, has assessed today's nuclear threat as, quote, "an unprecedented moment in human history. The world has never faced so many nuclear flashpoints simultaneously. From NATO-Russia tensions to the Korean Peninsula to South Asia and the South China Sea and Taiwan. All of the nuclear-armed states are tangled up in conflicts and crises that could catastrophically escalate at any moment. Contributing to this alarming trend is the increased scale and tempo of war games by nuclear-armed states and their allies, including nuclear drills. Ongoing missile tests and frequent close encounters between military forces of nuclear-armed states, including the U.S. and Russia, and the U.S. and China, exacerbate nuclear dangers. On January 25, 2018, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the hands of its iconic doomsday clock 30 seconds closer to the end of humanity. 2 minutes to midnight, as close as it's ever been set since its inception in 1947, citing, quote, "the failure of President Trump and other world leaders to deal with looming threats of nuclear war and climate change." In 2007, Jonathan Schell wrote, quote, "Global warming and nuclear war are two different ways that humanity having grown powerful through science, through production, through population growth, threatens to undo the natural underpinnings of human and all other life. Almost exactly 1 year ago, on September 8th, 2008, we organized a No Nukes, No Wars, No Warming contingent in the Rise for Climate, Jobs, and Justice March in San Francisco, and we issued the following call to action. We are marching for nuclear abolition and global survival because the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists this year moved the hands of its symbolic doomsday clock to 2 minutes to midnight, as close as it's ever been, citing the failure of President Trump and other world leaders to deal with looming threats of nuclear war and climate change, and declaring, quote, the world is as threatening as it has been since World War II. Because nearly 14,000 nuclear weapons, most in order of magnitude more powerful than the United States atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 92% held by the US and Russia, continue to pose an intolerable threat to humanity and the Earth's environment. Because the dangers of wars among nuclear-armed states are growing, and all of the nuclear-armed states are engaged in programs to maintain and modernize their nuclear arsenals. Because the United States is actively engaged in wars and military activities in 76 countries, and 39% of those on the planet. Because the US military is the largest institutional consumer of oil in the world, with an enormous impact on climate change. Because climate change causes refugee flows and fuels international tensions that can lead to war. Because conventional wars fought over oil and other diminishing resources could escalate to nuclear exchanges by accident, miscalculation, or design. Because the U.S. is violating its general obligations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to protect the environment, and under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to negotiate the global elimination of nuclear weapons. Because nuclear energy creates radioactive poisons that remain lethal for hundreds of thousands of years and contributes to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, it is an unacceptable part of the solution to climate change. Because nuclear weapons and global warming are two different ways that the human species can do enough damage to the ecosystems we depend on to threaten not only our own survival, but that of most life on this planet. Because nuclear weapons and global warming are predictable products of an economy and society dependent on endless material growth, driven for centuries by ruthless competition among authoritarian organizations of ever-increasing size. Because in this time of multiple global crises, our work for the elimination of nuclear weapons takes place in a broader framework, taking into account the interface between nuclear and conventional weapons and militarism in general, the humanitarian and long-term environmental consequences of nuclear war, and the fundamental incompatibility of nuclear weapons with democracy, the rule of law, and human well-being. We take action today and each day forward to defend all life from the twin threats of thermonuclear war and global climate catastrophe. We rise up in solidarity today to achieve an ecologically sustainable and nuclear-free world tomorrow. Thanks. And I give the microphone to Marcia Campos.
Let's see. Well, I was introduced like the director of a project north of Tlatelolco, and I have to first, for the intriguing hat of being north of Tlatelolco, explain that Tlatelolco is next to the center of Mexico City, and it's, if you know, Mexico was a lake area. So when the Spaniards came, the resistance took place in Tlatelolco across the lake. But it is also a very important site, a heritage site for humanity, because that's where the first nuclear-free zone in a highly populated area, besides Antarctica, was signed. So creating this nuclear-free zone from south of the border to Patagonia, where no nuclear weapons exist, no nuclear weapons can be deployed, and the superpowers agreed not to attack as we are a nuclear-free zone area. So that's pretty important, and it's very unknown, you know? Thank you, thank you. We should know. The Tlatelolco Treaty turned 50 in 2017, and coincidentally with, you know, the whole situation with the northern border of Mexico, southern border of the United States, something good, a crack where the light can come in, like Leonard Cohen says. There is a plate there, a monolith with the consigning that that's where the free zone starts, all the way south. So that's a little bit about the Tlatelolco thing. But in less than 15 minutes, I want to convince you that the Global South has always been relevant and remains very relevant for this quest against time to ban nuclear weapons. Jackie made a historical line on how 1945 is a turning point for humanity. Clearly, the 20th century unleashed productive forces that were never seen before. The massification of the industry of death comes to fruition with the nuclear bomb in Hiroshima and the horrors that Jackie described. But it's also the end of the Second World War. And with that, keep in mind that the Second World War took place between 1939 and 1945, but leaves behind a Europe that could not hold the colonial powers. And immediately following the war, between 1945 and 1952, about 25 new states were created. So the imperial powers have to yield to a new geopolitical configuration, and these new states that were free relatively of the imperial powers, they reclaim and rethink their national identity and created a very important organization, the non-aligned movement. They come to life exactly at the birth of the first Cold War. This is consigned by now. There are two Cold Wars. One that happened, and that is the second one that is happening right now. But the first Cold War brought a breeze of hope of a third alternative for the peripheral world, so-called, and an urgency to be away from the confrontation of superpowers that began to happen immediately after the end of the war. The confrontation between the United States and the former Soviet Union. While this first Cold War was more of a chill, the second Cold War is way more hot, to say something. But the aftermath of the war and this post-colonial period was not exempt from proxy wars like Vietnam and even Cuba, where the superpowers found grounds for confrontation. And Vietnam left a deep mark in the United States, and Cuba left a big mark in Latin America. So there is an effort of independence, self-determination, peaceful resolution of conflicts. That was the ideology of the non-aligned movement, and it is still the ideology of the non-aligned movement. So Latin America was the place where the world is being closest to a nuclear confrontation in 1962, when the missiles crisis in Cuba happened and was a step away from nuclear catastrophe. So with this in mind, the This is very interesting because Latin America is seen as a unified field. It is not. There is a huge differences between these states, and probably it is the only and the most relevant continental effort, Bolivarian, I would say, effort to unify Latin America in the consensus that we didn't want nuclear weapons in our territory, nor Russian nor US nuclear weapons in the Latin American territory. And that's the feeling, the sentiment, and the thought that gave place to the Tlatelolco Treaty that bans in perpetuity nuclear weapons from the continent, including possessions in islands that are under the jurisdiction of nuclear powers. Following that, we have a period in Latin America of democracies, hopes of a new alternative. And as a Chilean national, I will set forth the example of Chile. After Cuba, we already knew that there was no possibility of an independence, political independence, or a new economic model that would benefit the vast majorities of impoverished people in Latin America. So we created the agendas, ways to power by raising the awareness of the people, non-violently, and gain through the vote the government. We all know, I'm not going to expand on that, how the experience of Salvador Allende ended, and I believe that that was the end of innocence for humanity, because if we harbor the idea that that was possible, it was aborted in a brutal ways. Well, but like my grandmother said, to the worst day, there is always a tomorrow. So life went on with dictatorships through Latin America, and it is meaningful, and I believe it's something to think about, that there was no breach in or second thoughts about this Tlatelolco nuclear-free zone. That is the good news. And then 1989 comes, and the fall of the Berlin Wall changes the paradigm around the world with the subsequent fall of the Soviet Union, which sustained a number of the movements and left parties in Latin America. Well, the end of the Soviet Union creates a reality that was a matter of concern, I would say. So Fidel Castro and Lula in Brazil, they created something that is called the Sao Paulo Forum. That is an organization that gathers all progressive movements and parties of Latin America and designed a democratic ways to serve, I would say, the perpetual crises in Latin America of poverty and isolation. The Sao Paulo Forum was really productive. It is a time of upsurge of democratic movements, the end of Pinochet dictatorship, democracy around the continent. It would be very nice that we were still living that. But the Honduras coup in 2009 was like a thunderbolt, like in a clear day. But it was just the sparkle that triggered a whole right-wing, pendulum along the continent. And we are seeing the biggest crisis in Latin America since World War II. And the inclusion of Latin America again in this second Cold War that officially is launched by Harvard scholars, Yuval Weber, is 2016 is the beginning of the second Cold War, which is more dangerous than the first Cold War, because as I said, it's not a chill, but a downright conflict with many players and more nuclear states involved, and it is a multilateral conflict. There are diminishing resources. Global warming is affecting vast areas in Latin America. Migration of crops is a reality. I know that in Chile, some of those crops are migrating south. We have droughts, we have a crisis. This is not a new crisis of capitalism, because the background is nature, and nature you cannot change. I appreciate the objectives of this conference to preserve the earth, but we are also there in a run against time. Well, we are confronting a missiles crisis. The ABM treaty expired. The INF treaty, intermediate range missiles, expired some few days ago, and the United States is embarked in an arms race along with Russia. The USA fired a missile that flew 500 kilometers right August 18th, a few days ago. And the accident in northern Russia took place in August 8th. So we are seeing this arms race. So why Latin America may still matter? Well, the Tlatelolco Treaty was the footprint for other nuclear-free zones. I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. The Rarotonga Treaty, nuclear-free zone, that comprehends the South Pacific, was signed in '86, almost 20 years after Tlatelolco. Bangkok in Asia, 1997. Mongolia in 2000. Central Asia, 2009. Palindaba in Africa, 2009. So most of the world, 116 countries, live in nuclear-free zones. That's pretty impressive. Okay, I just want to cross this information with what is happening in the United Nations, that I believe, let me grab my notes, around 2012, there was a shift in the United Nations to bring the subject of nuclear weapons beyond the Security Council, beyond security in general, and think and call scientists to research on consequences, human consequences of nuclear weapons. So the determination of a conference in Oslo in 2013 was so overwhelmingly successful that, and so many new players came to the picture, that they continued the conference in Nayarit, Mexico, in the anniversary of the Tlatelolco Treaty, and was concluded in Vienna. And these three conferences concluded that this is the point of no return. We need to ban nuclear weapons. But the problem remains the same. The Global South is already a nuclear-free zone by choice. All of these nuclear-free zones have relinquished, but have terminated any ambition of nuclear weaponizing their territories. But the humanitarian conferences gave place to something really interesting. the UN ban treaty, in which 122 countries voted for abolition of nuclear weapons. But that's the Global South. And that is the product of a movement that began, as I said, in the 60s and carried unaltered. This is a very dynamic area. You must have read how many dictatorships, coup d'etat, changes in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, you have heard throughout the years. Yet, the positioning of all of these countries is to remain a nuclear-free zone. So these are the states that votes in the ban, 122 countries that voted for the ban of nuclear weapons. Now, in order to conclude my presentation, I think that we have a very blind eye to the Global South, because since there are no nuclear weapons there is no problem with them. But these are the countries that carry the struggle in the UN, in different places, in Mexico in particular, and Latin America, for being the first nuclear-free zone, have consistently, carried the message to the rest of the world. I still have to convince many that Latin America matters. The United States is the third Latino country in the world, 50 million strong, with a legacy of nuclear-free zone. We should, for sure, make a difference in the United States. The United States, again, is the third Latino country in the world, after Mexico and Colombia. And these migrants that live in the United States have some saying for life in the same ways that in the UN, all of these efforts for abolition are spearheaded by these countries that do not have nuclear weapons, led in a main portion by Latin America. We may think that migrants in the United States can join the nuclear disarmament movement at a time in history that there is no ways out. So with that, I think I'll be very happy to be available for comments. To me, it's really important. And if there is a hope, it's not going to be only at the UN headquarters. We have to face it. Youth in California and in many places is vastly minorities. So we need to connect the dots and come all together for the preservation of life. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. So, an obvious question to ask is, why are we talking about nuclear disarmament at a conference that's mainly about alternative agriculture? So, I think it's worth doing because I believe that very broad, sustained social movements will be necessary to accomplish the profound transformation that will be needed if humanity is to be able to have much of a future at all. Reconstruction of the food system is a key strand, but not the only one. The other basic needs for sustaining human life, water, energy, transportation, housing, and health, all are in need of reconstruction to bring them back into balance with the limits and rhythms of the ecosystems we all depend on. To a considerable extent, these transformations must start at the bottom, with the construction of an alternative culture and the beginnings of an alternative economy. This kind of change takes time. But the unprecedented combination of ecological stresses, resource limits, and a new round of competition among long-established global economic powers and ascendant challengers also is creating an accelerating risk of war among nuclear-armed countries. The questions of peace, democracy, economic equality, and the ecological requisites for human survival never have been as inextricably linked as they are now. The ecological challenges we face are both a cause and effect of the deteriorating political conditions that drive international conflict. The loss of very human-scale organizations in the social and political world, combined with the concentration of economic power in organizations of ever greater scale and scope, has left us vulnerable to authoritarian politics. The dynamics that drive the global economy, endless competition for material wealth and social power, is straining the limits of the ecosystems we all depend on. Yet the main solution offered to us by governments is to gird for more competition and for more war. So our challenge is not only to imagine and to begin to build a sustainable society from below. We must at the same time keep the immense machinery of violence that both sustains and is part of the top tier of the stratified global economy from destroying everything before we have a chance to make much progress. There was a time when different aspects of the movements for a more fair, peaceful, and ecologically sustainable society seemed more integrated. People whose main focus was on the environment or on building an alternative economy seemed to devote a little more of their time to global issues as well as working against war and against the threat of nuclear annihilation. And the first step towards bringing these threads back together is a conversation against among the newly emerging movements and the movements that are kind of finding their legs again after decades of a period of low political mobilization, really a decade, 3 decades of low political mobilization. And I don't have the answers for how to do this. So what I want to do is tell a couple of stories about nuclear-related campaigns as food for thought. One was a regional campaign right here in the Bay Area. The other a national and international effort focused in the United States and in India. One was successful and one was not. And along the way, I'll offer some observations about how our various struggles were linked in these campaigns, as well as how opportunities to link them were missed. And basically, it's a story about how single-issue approaches really aren't enough when what is really needed is systemic change. So the first story is about the successful campaign to stop the basing of nuclear-armed Navy ships in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1980s. The Navy's plan was to put 17 additional combat ships plus a lot of support vessels here in the Bay. 10 of the ships would have been armed with nuclear-capable cruise missiles. New Navy facilities, including those needed to load the cruise missiles onto the ships, would have been built at 5 locations throughout the region. Some of the new facilities were to be constructed at sites heavily contaminated with toxic materials from past industrial and military activity. The projects also required extensive dredging and dredge spoil disposal, which would have had really severe impacts on San Francisco Bay, one of the most ecologically significant estuaries on the west coast of the Americas. The campaign to oppose this giant project overcame initial problems stemming from a single-issue focus. It brought together a coalition that included disarmament groups, organizations opposing U.S. intervention in Central America, local chapters of environmental groups like the Audubon Society and the Sierra Club, and elements of organized labor. Although few expected this opposition effort to prevail, since it began during the heart of the Reagan military buildup, it did. The entire multi-part Navy plan was defeated after a 5-year struggle. The campaign developed understanding of military toxic waste issues, an emerging issue at the time. It built new political ties, becoming part of many, many campaigns over the years which both express and help to maintain the network of organizations and relationships that make the San Francisco Bay Area a relatively progressive region. It built some of the basis, for example, for the network that later showed support for Barbara Lee in her lone opposition at the outset of the Afghanistan war and the broad congressional abrogation of power to the executive branch after 9/11. But the campaign opposing Navy home porting also had shortcomings, now apparent in retrospect. It was mainly oppositional in form and still rooted to a large degree in traditional environmentalism. At the time, it represented a step forward focusing on source reduction, eliminating polluting, socially unnecessary activities, rather than the end-of-the-pipe regulatory approaches that were still prevalent in the early 80s. But it offered no real alternative vision for the future development of the region's economy, which addressed the core issues of the ecological or economic crises that were to come. It argued for the superior economic benefits of favoring civilian development rather than military, but offered no specific civilian development model in terms of energy or transportation or the types of goods and services to be produced. The dominant economic development forces in the Bay Area in the decades that followed arguably were not all that much better from either a regional or a global perspective. The Bay Area became the center for computer and internet booms, built in large part on the basis of huge previous military research and development investment in those technologies and driven by burgeoning finance capital looking for outlets. The region became wealthier but more economically stratified, with stark disparities in wealth and income, decaying infrastructure, and a general decline in public goods. The second example is the campaign from 2005 to 2008 to stop the US-India nuclear deal, a deal designed to allow full cooperation on civilian nuclear energy between the two countries. This campaign was unsuccessful, and the deal was approved in the fall of 2008. The deal was opposed by US disarmament groups almost entirely on nuclear nonproliferation grounds. The agreement allows India full access to trade in nuclear fuel and technology, despite the fact that India has refused to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and has developed nuclear weapons. Access to international sources of nuclear reactor fuel allows India to devote more of its own scarce domestic uranium supply to expanding its nuclear arsenal. Now, these nuclear non-proliferation arguments were true and they were important. But the deal also had important implications for choices in energy technology and for the future development path of the global economy as a whole. Understanding and discussing these broad implications might have provided a useful educational moment and a chance to build broader coalitions. But these opportunities, unfortunately, were ignored by most of the groups in the United States that opposed the deal. The Senate debates and the votes on the financial industry bailout in the wake of the 2008 financial crash and the US-India nuclear deal took place on the same day in the fall of 2008. And both votes illustrated the power of immense interest to easily crush single-issue progressive groups on all but small things in business-as-usual politics. The narrow focus on the nuclear deal's proliferation impacts did not address all the other forces lined up in favor of the deal, and did not construct any narrative or provide any analysis that might have mobilized broader attention, interest, and opposition. The battle over the nuclear deal went on for 3 years without any attempt to make broader connections by the deal's most visible opponents. Thus, the deal could be jammed through basically under cover of the bank bailout with very little attention because of the gravity of the financial crisis. So I want to provide a sketch of the arguments that might have been made and that a few of us were making at the time, but for the most part were not. The US-India nuclear deal was part of a larger set of changes in the US-India relationship that elites in both countries were seeking, each with an eye to maximizing their own wealth and power. US military planners at the time envisioned India as a possible forward base for operations from South Asia to the Middle East, and perhaps as a junior partner in those operations as well. Arms makers saw a huge potential profit from increased arms sales, with India being one of the world's largest importers of high-tech weapons. US-based multinationals were gearing up for expansion into India, hoping to use the enhanced security partnership as a wedge to further open India to foreign investment and sales, not only in nuclear technology and services, but in everything from banking and finance to food and agriculture to big box retail stores. As Vandana Shiva, one of the people who inspired these soil and oil conferences, observed at the time, the nuclear deal is the cutting edge, but what the United States is really seeking is agricultural markets and real estate markets, the land of the poor in India. The ambitions of elites in the two countries to strengthen their military and economic ties was reflected in a set of initiatives announced by US President Bush and India's Prime Minister Singh in July 2005, together with the agreement in principle on nuclear trade and cooperation. A few weeks earlier, the two countries had agreed to a new framework for a US-India defense relationship. That called for increased military cooperation across a wide range of activities, from joint exercises and intelligence exchanges to increased weapons trade to collaboration in missile defense development. The July 2005 agreements also established a chief executive officers forums to, quote, harness private sector energy and ideas to deepen the bilateral economic relationship, close quotes, and an agreement for closer cooperation in space technology and commercial space activities, and a knowledge initiative on agriculture. The U.S. private sector members of the Agricultural Knowledge Initiative Governing Board are Archer Daniels Midland, diversified giant that takes agricultural products from the world over, turns them into commodities ranging from processed foods to biofuels and industrial chemicals, biotech giant Monsanto, and Walmart, the world's largest retailer. The CEO Forum's agenda was a kind of a wish list for the deregulation and opening of India's economy. This included, for example, greatly expanding the degree to which foreign banking and financial services companies can operate in India. So what kinds of connections might have been made by the opponents of the US-India deal, in part by linking it to this larger package of deals of which it was the centerpiece? As an energy source, nuclear power generation remains a poor choice for a variety of reasons beyond its inherent environmental risks and its inextricable links to nuclear weapons. Nuclear power plants require investments in large, expensive facilities that then commit a society to using that technology at its particular level of development when built in large quantities for long periods of time, decades. Both energy conservation measures and decentralized alternative energy technologies can be deployed in far smaller increments and thus can more easily take advantage of constant improvements in technology. Renewable energy technologies also are much more likely to give the hundreds of millions of people in India and elsewhere living in rural areas not served by an electric power grid a chance to move up the energy ladder and to do so in ways that do not contribute to global warming. Renewable technologies also create a wider range of jobs in a broader range of social settings. Yes, we know. Increased global trade in these technologies would accelerate their development and also encourage their adoption in the United States. Most of the other agreements that were part of the nuclear deal package also focused on industries that were highly concentrated, where expanded trade and economic activity are likely to intensify disparities of wealth, both in the United States and in India. High-tech arms production, for example, in addition to contributing to further militarization of international relations in the context of growing global military tensions, creates relatively few jobs per dollar of public spending. And increased arms trade concentrates wealth and political power in military-industrial complexes in both countries. In the broader global context, nuclear power and high-technology weapons are both elements in and help to sustain a global circulation of trade and investment devoted to the production of goods and services that only a fraction of the world's population can afford to buy. Large organizations, whether public or private, provide services and buy and sell mainly to each other or to consumers who are the upper echelon inhabitants of those same organizations, the new classes of technocrats and bureaucrats, managers and professionals who constitute the modern middle class. This dynamic pushes much of the world's population towards the margin, with luxury crops, resource extraction, and now biofuels driving hundreds of millions off the land into burgeoning urban slums worldwide. Yet development efforts continue to center on energy and transportation infrastructure designed to serve global supply chains for upmarket consumer goods, with urban areas worldwide competing to stay or become stable nodes in the top tier of the global economy. The result is a world characterized by islands of great wealth and a deepening sea of poverty. And in this kind of world, weapons and military services always are going to be a growth industry. If the US-based arms control and disarmament groups had made the connections to these aspects of the US-India nuclear deal that were intended to cement both countries firmly to the neoliberal development path, the fact that the nuclear deal came up in Congress at the same time when that development model itself was in crisis might have provided an opportunity. Other constituencies might have understood that this was an issue that touched on their concerns as well and might have joined in the opposition. But instead, the deal was generally viewed as just one more piece of congressional business that could be jammed through under the cover of the larger and, in the view of most, unconnected financial crisis. Now, at a conference like this one, I see exciting ideas for local alternatives to the current development path, for more ecologically sustainable and democratically controllable ways to provide ourselves with the necessities of life. These are essential responses to some of the kinds of problems that I've been talking about. They provide elements of a positive vision and give people concrete ways to participate in realizing it. But at the same time, I worry about problems of scale and urgency, of the disparity between the problems we face and the resources we've been able to muster so far. The institutions of global corporate capitalism and militarism roll on, devastating lives and ecosystems, with high-tech wars now part of their routine operation, and with their routine operation creating the conditions for even more destructive wars to come. They will neither stop what they're doing nor stand politely by while we create an alternative world. I want to close with a passage written more than half a century ago by Lewis Mumford, one of the most trenchant and prophetic critics of nuclear weapons and of the path our modernity and its technologies have taken. His words could as well have been written this morning. Our problem in every department is to slow down or bring to a halt the forces that now threaten us, to break into the cycle of expansion and disintegration by establishing new premises, closer to the demands of life, which will enable us to change our direction and in many areas to make a fresh start.
So originally, this session was supposed to end at 5:10. It's just a little bit before 5 now. We started about 10 minutes late because people were still eating and drinking and making noise. So if people would like to make some comments or put forward some questions, we would be happy to try to address them. Please use the microphone.
Okay. I grew up during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember it very well. We were trained in the idea of nuclear war, scare the heck out of us. So you don't have that in the youth of this era. They don't understand that. They don't have a dread. Okay, so right there you've got a real problem. We're talking about disarmament, but no one, in this country we're taking gun control, right? But why not missile control? And if we're going to have missile control, why not have the same criteria where the civilian population can go check and make sure they actually got put away, just like they're going to make sure if they come and take guns away. Why not have the same standard? In fact, why not have our government lead the way? Disarm itself with its guns away, just like it's asking the citizenry to. And I don't see this talked about. I mean, if we look, and I'm going to stop here real quick, sorry. If we look at the media, the threats that you're talking about, so real and so powerful, and it makes any so-called mass murders trivial by comparison. We should have a discussion of that as least as loud as the other. And we're not. And you got to ask yourself why. I want to thank you for the Global South. I want to point out one other thing. We didn't vote to have nuclear weapons, did we? Was that talked about? Did the world ever ask, well, before we built this thing, or even think about building it, what do you guys think? How about it? And so that's why today, even though the majority of the people in the UN said no, you don't get listened to. You never were. Don't expect to be listened to, because the people that rammed this through did it in the dark of night.
May I make a comment? It may sound too optimistic and claim the history of Latin America and the Global South, but the timeline of the movement is created the same thing in Latin America. It's like we don't have any problem anymore. The environment is one system, and the nuclear winter that would follow to a confrontation, I mean, it's a matter that perhaps in the next Soil and Oil we could bring some presenter on how this would affect all the crops around the world. But I regret to say that even in Mexico, where I was a political exile, and I know many of these political activists and even authorities, they don't think about nuclear weapons as a problem for us. Some don't even know that there is a Tlatelolco Treaty. The issue is somewhere in the diplomatic circles, even smaller academic circles, and some educated people don't even know that Ambassador Alfonso Garcia Robles won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1982 because of the treaty. So the main memory loss is not happening among baby boomers. It's the new generation that doesn't claim their history. And this is why it's strategically important to open this movement to the new youth and pass the heritage. Because, as I said, this is a problem for everybody that is alive in the world today. I am very pleased to inform that the mission campus of the San Francisco City College will host the first Latino Nuclear Disarmament Conference this coming month on October 23rd. And we hope to have grassroots people there. We have to stop talking to each other. We have to bring in the new generations. It's urgent. And we have to call this as it is. It is for life. I mean, my children have more occupancy in this planet than I do. So it's more their problem than my problem. And for us grandparents, it's really important to preserve the world for the future generations. And I think that is culturally friendly to Latinos that have a still very strong familial bonds for emotional, but also is survival. So the conference is called For Life. And I believe that that will open up a new chapter. I hope the San Francisco Bay Area has been historically a cradle of movements, and we are hoping that we can, ignite a sparkle there.
Just you want to say something?
One last thing. If we could connect, in my opinion, the mass murder with the mass murder that happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the fact that some loose screw could press the button. And I was surprised at the graduation in Berkeley. They were all worried about mass murder or gun shooting at the campus, but nobody was worried about the threat of nuclear war. That was not, and when you talked about it, they don't have a way to relate to that. But if we can connect those two, they're not different. The same nut pushes both buttons. Squeeze the trigger, push the button.
Yeah, just a note, when we were back in New York in the spring for the preparatory committee meetings for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which is coming up in 2020. One of the things that I noted in another event there was that there's much less of a problem right now with proliferation of nuclear weapons to countries that don't have them than the proliferation of authoritarian nationalist governments in countries that have nuclear weapons. And for me, that's the connecting point, that you have these irrationalist forces of blood and soil nationalism that are reemerging around the world. And they are driven by these same economic disparities and false solutions being offered for them. So in speaking to, I was thinking today more about making environmental connections, but when I'm talking to those kinds of audiences, that's one of the connections I try to make, is think about the fact that the kind of violence we saw in El Paso is being driven by these same kind of blood and soil nationalist forces. And part of that also, in terms of our collective obligation, is to be there for the people who are most directly targeted and affected by this. And again, it's going to take mass movements, cross-issue movements.
But it's got to be visceral.
Yeah.
The problem with the mass murders, that's visceral. We all watch it on TV, in the sense that you can watch programs like Lethal Weapon. I showed you how last time I watched it. That's driven home. How many Dr. Strangeloves has there been?
No, that's true. Other comments here from anyone?
I wanted to say something. Yeah. I wanted to say something. You've raised some important points, and I think the fact that nuclear weapons are fundamentally undemocratic is a very important one. That's true around the world. I think the connection between big violence and small visceral violence is also very important. We are not talking about the fact that the United States has been at war for more than 20 years, has military operations in 76 countries, is spending 35% of the world's military budget. These are questions we have been wrestling with for years now. How do we get people to, express their concerns about this, to understand how terribly wrong this is, what an incredibly violent system we live in. So I wanted to say that on a very tangible level, one of the hats I wear as a North American coordinator of Mayors for Peace. Mayors for Peace is an international network of nearly 8,000 mayors in 163 countries, led by the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was established in 1982, coming out of that UN Second Special on Disarmament, to call for the elimination of nuclear weapons. In the US, we primarily work through the US Conference of Mayors, which is the national nonpartisan association of mayors of big cities, cities with populations over 30,000. And for 14 consecutive years, Mayors for Peace has been able to get that, the National US Conference of Mayors to unanimously adopt very strong resolutions supporting nuclear disarmament. The one that was passed on July 1st of this year calls on all presidential candidates to make known their positions on nuclear weapons and to pledge US global leadership in preventing nuclear war, returning to diplomacy, and negotiating the elimination of nuclear weapons. And we've heard a lot of public agitation for debates on climate, how the candidates, but we're not hearing this. So I'm offering this piece of information to you to pick up a flyer here to spread the word. Our lead U.S. mayor is the mayor of Des Moines, Iowa. And so he hopefully is going to be in a position to raise this question when the candidates come to Des Moines and when the caucuses happen there.
I don't really need a mic.
You don't need a mic.
You don't have to walk back there. You sort of said something pretty interesting that nuclear technology for energy is only as good as the technology that it's built on, right? And I already know the answer to my question, but I'd love to hear it from the expert opinions. Is there any place for nuclear power to power our world and needs while other emerging technologies are being developed? Is there a way to roll it back once it's been implemented?
The elimination of nuclear power is probably going to be relatively slow, and is mainly going to happen because it's not economically competitive. You probably already know it's very heavily cross-subsidized in a variety of ways, including, of course, the limitations on liability for the nuclear power operators and equipment manufacturers for nuclear accidents. So it'll probably be around for a while in terms of the existing plants, but again, it's hugely expensive. And despite all of the efforts that have been made to come up with, for example, the current trendy thing in nuclear power is small modular reactors, which so far aren't that small and aren't that modular and are still really expensive. You're making a huge capital investment in a technology that's fixed in time. The lifespan of nuclear power plants is typically 40 plus years, and most of them are getting on 60 and so forth. And you can do a whole lot of technology development in all kinds of alternative renewables, including the ones that the types of technologies you need to think about to deal with the peak load problems, various ways of storing electricity. But really, one of the most important things is to start looking at the structure of the economy. The obvious thing is we can't afford to waste nearly as much energy as we do. And the other obvious thing is that we cannot, on a finite planet, have a system that depends permanently on endless material growth. We have to start figuring out some other principle to organize the global economy.
Can I just add something? I just want to add a couple of things. Secrecy. again, nuclear power is, as Andy said, very centralized, capital intensive, and secretive. It has to be. It has to be because a nuclear power plant provides the materials potentially to develop a weapon. It's also not carbon neutral. The generation of the energy is carbon neutral, but the construction of the plants, which use a lot of concrete, is not. Then there's the problem of the fuel. Uranium mining, incredibly dirty and dangerous, disproportionately impacts indigenous people here and all over the world. Then the resulting so-called spent fuel, the spent fuel rods, which are incredibly dangerous, radioactive for thousands and thousands of years. No way has been found to neutralize them or to store them safely. Again, where they're looking at storage sites, indigenous people's lands. So, I mean, I feel very strongly there's nothing good about nuclear power. And I'm really annoyed by the, I mean, that's a mild term, for the propaganda machine that's spitting out all this as a solution to climate change. It isn't a good analogy, I think. Think of it as, you know, as factory farming. Do we want more factory farming, or do we need to completely redesign that system so that it's sustainable and environmentally sustainable and so on?
I just want to say something about Chile. Chile was the first and the best successful, you know, neoliberal experiment. Some say that it was worth the bloodshed after Pinochet. The expansion of the economy of Chile that doesn't have fossil fuels, it makes a case for bringing more energy. And the discussion that you just presented of nuclear power it was present. Yet, it's not cost effective. Having a desert like the desert of Atacama that has so much sun, the competition in the market makes a case to keep clean energy instead of building, you know, nuclear plants. So that's an example of how the industry of energy is moving. In another case, we have Mexico. Maybe some of you are interested in what's going on there with this strange, you know, experiment, anti-corruption in a country that it has almost a failed state. Well, the president is choosing to build new plants for processing oil, which is exactly the opposite. So it looks like the humanity is debating, and what you were saying is so true, that we have to redefine happiness, we have to rethink our future, and reduce instead of trying to keep more and more producing. Even recycling is more carbon intensive than non-recycling at certain times. Because imagine us from the Bay Area shipping our trash to China, and then they sending another ship to another island country, the trash, just to rebuild an object there. So not even recycling is, we have to reduce. But we are far from, you know, having leadership that will, you know, design a future for the young generation to adopt as a flag, as a movement. But that's what we need.
2 minutes. Does somebody else back here?
Just 2 minutes.
Any did you have your hand up?
I'll pass. We only have 2 minutes. I'll pass.
Oh, well, why don't you take the 2 minutes?
We can solve all the problems.
I'm glad we're having this conversation, because just like soil not oil, without talking about extreme extraction of energy is not going to be enough of the solution. They used to say when you find yourself in a hole you don't want to be in, the first thing to do is stop digging. In algebra, which for me was more than half a century ago, there was a question. I remember I walked up to my teacher afterwards. I said, why do we have 2 pages of questions about an object falling from a plane? In every question it's worded as falling from a plane. What object could that be other than a bomb? Anything else would have, I mean, it's to teach the formula of 32 feet per second for acceleration. But what other object could there be falling from a plane that there wouldn't be some effort to try to slow that fall, etc. In second-year algebra, my job included teaching critical thinking. In second-year algebra, there's 2 pages of questions without ever naming nuclear energy that's all based about how long it takes to reach a half-life. Because again, it's a teachable formula. I would say to my students, what do you think they're talking about? It's not carbon dating. What is happening here, and what are you supposed to learn from this? And then Apple eliminated the floppy disk drive. Because the question had been, can you name any language that was in use 10,000 years ago and still has any fluency now? But no, it's not even about the language, it's just how would that information be stored? This is where you go, this is where you don't go, because bad things are located here. These fuel rods, whatever. And you go, well, the skull and crossbones? No, some of the kids comes across that and goes, pirates, fun, let's go. So this is clearly a problem that will come back to haunt generations that I can't even imagine. And therefore it's worth talking about it. The one other connection I would take the liberty of pointing out is that the arms manufacturers that manufacture our weapons for our government are the same people who manufacture the weapons that they want sold on the market and the ammunition, etc. It's all about increasing their profit margin. They don't give a explicative about what happens with them afterwards. That's not their concern. So the government is severely compromised, whether they're talking about fuel or whether they're talking about guns on the streets, because they're desperate to get this material for their war machine, and their war machine is desperate to sell it because that's where their profit margin is. So I agree, I take the limit. It was the gentleman who talked about calling for, but I think that it was implicit in each of your presentations. We need a different system that's going to be focused on those things that all polls say 70, 80, 90% of the population actually cares about when it's brought to their attention. And most of the media is devoted to it not being brought to their attention, or when it is, it goes through this short news cycle and then falls right back off again, because again, they're interested in a profit margin, because people won't come back 2, 3, 6 weeks, 2 months, 5 years later to go, so we're still talking about this, which is the point Greta Thunberg makes so eloquently in 11 minutes. It is a crisis. We do need to address it, and it was pointed out to me my calendar was misplaced, because it's not this Friday, it's a week from this Friday, that all of us have an opportunity to do that yet again. And the point that I make, which I would gladly take volunteers, because I represent an all-volunteer nonprofit 501c3, is yes, it's important to show up. It's important to recognize how many of us there are. It's important to realize that the powers that be have someone working even on the day we show up, and certainly on the following Monday. So what are you going to be doing on the following Monday and the Thursday that follows that? And I realize economics doesn't make it possible for people to be organizing this way daily, but basically ongoing until this problem is solved, because the people that bring it to us have a vested interest in it not going away. It's where their economic model of profit lies. And it's, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe we'll close. Just one last note. In the 80s, in that campaign to stop the Navy ships from being put here with nuclear weapons, I was the guy who put on the suit and filed the briefs and all the exhibits and so forth. And I made some pretty good arguments. But that's not why we won. We won because every single hearing room was packed to overflowing with people holding up pictures of their children or their favorite place or whatever they thought was most important that was going to be affected by these projects.
It was visceral.
So that's how you do it.
Extinction Rebellion, which has had 2 demonstrations in the city that I'm aware of, closed London by demonstrating daily for like 23 days. And at the end of that, in order to get London back open, the Parliament did agree that they would at least address the issue. Now, that hasn't happened yet with Brexit, et cetera, but the point is, it has to be sustained, and it has to be mass movement, which is the other thing that what brings is going. We can't have this be a white middle class movement. We need to involve all workers and their families everywhere in order to sustain this, in order to win this, and we need to not forget the people who are our allies afterwards.
So I think we're out of time. I wanted to thank Soil Not Oil for offering us this workshop time. And I also wanted to invite you all, if you want to stay in touch with us, we have a sign-up sheet over here and some literature that is related to the things that we talked about today.